Welcome to the Whistleblower Newsroom. I'm Christina Borgeson. Recently, the U.S. fled Afghanistan, leaving the Taliban in charge and many American servicemen and women furious and perplexed about why they were sent there to put their lives on the line in the first place. History has the answers, and my guest today knows that history. Lawyer and author Charlotte Dennett lays it out in her book, The Crash of Flight 3804, which details her investigation into the mysterious life and death of her father, Daniel Dennett, America's first master spy in the Middle East, while also taking a deep dive into the history of Western intervention in the Middle East, known as, quote, the Great Game, unquote. Dennett reveals that at the heart of it all is the big bloody business of oil, attended by brutal barons, dictators, spies, and terrorists who work and fight together in a murderous, obscenely profitable ecosystem that most recently has left American taxpayers and troops bereft and Afghanistan in the hands of a fundamentalist group originally funded by the US to protect a pipeline route. Welcome, Charlotte.
Thank you.
So let's start with the deep history. And the first context that you talked about in your chapter that starts dealing with Afghanistan, you talked about how fundamentalists are used to pacify opponents for conquests. So talk about the history of that a little bit, and then talk about how that's been used in the Middle East.
Yeah, well, first of all, I discovered the role of fundamentalists when my husband, Jerry Colby, and I were investigating the genocide of indigenous people in Latin America. And we discovered that there were American fundamentalists called the Wycliffe Bible Translators in the US and the Summer Institute of Linguistics in South America. And their job was effectively to pacify the indigenous people so they would make room for big oil and ranch and ag to move in on their lands, to get them to be pro-America. So that's when we learned that using fundamentalists is a crucial part of empire building, really, of conquest. So when we started getting into the Middle East, actually the person who set me off on this investigation in Afghanistan was Eleanor Smeal, who I had known in Vermont. She was the president of the National Organization for Women. And at a 2000 conference on feminism, she ran into me and she said, "Hey, Charlotte, you've been following what's going on in Afghanistan?" And at that moment, I really hadn't been. And she said, "It's all about oil and fundamentalism." So that got me very curious. And
now, what year was that? What year was that?
That was 2000. And around that very time, fortunately, a book had come out by Ahmed Rashid, who was a Pakistani journalist. And I think he was one of the first to cover what the hell was going on in Afghanistan with regard to this group that called itself the Taliban. A lot of people had never heard of it before. And so he investigated. And what it really came down to is he eventually discovered, I think he went into a meeting with Afghan government officials, and out came these individuals with briefcases dressed in Western attire. That's when he began to realize there might be an oil connection or a business connection. And then he investigated further, and he found out that this group, the Taliban, had been courted by oil companies. And the reason, particularly an American one called Unocal, and they had even been, believe this or not, they had even been hosted in Texas, wined and dined. Why? Because their role was to protect a pipeline that was going to run from Turkmenistan through Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. So it's name is TAPI, the TAPI pipeline. And what it was intended to do is to carry oil and gas from the Caspian Sea. Mind you, our friends Bush and Cheney were heavily, let's say Cheney, beginning with Halliburton, which is a supply company for oil companies. He was scouting around the Caspian Sea as early as the 1990s because people were looking at the Caspian Sea as the next great Middle East. It had a lot of energy in that, and the whole problem was it was landlocked. And so how do you transport the oil? That's a big issue in many of these cases. And what I came to learn is that pipelines are crucial to getting the oil to market, and people don't pay much attention to it. But if you can't get the oil to market, it's just sitting there, it's not doing any good. And then I learned, actually by investigating my father's death, that there can often be a lot of intrigue around where the route is, what country it goes through, who controls it, and who protects it. So the original idea was the Taliban, which had actually been funded by Pakistan. A lot of them were refugees along the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. They became known as valiant warriors, and the only ethnic groups, supposedly, that could protect the pipeline route. So that was the plan. Then it changed. You want me to tell you why it changed?
Yes. Why did
it change? It changed after 9/11. It changed after 9/11. The relations had begun to sour right before 9/11, and some of it was over what they were going to get in transit fees. This is a big motivating factor for the Taliban. What kind of transit fees are they going to accrue from this? And then after 9/11, the U.S. posed conditions on them and said, look, we'll move forward on this deal as long as you turn over Osama bin Laden, because Osama bin Laden had been in Afghanistan, and the whole U.S. narrative was that 9/11 happened because he was the planner of 9/11. So they said, we will work with you, but you got to turn him over. And the Taliban said, well, give us the proof that he was involved. And the proof was never forthcoming. So instead, what happened is Bush sent our troops into Afghanistan.
Now, wait a second.
And this time,
wait a second.
Yeah.
This is something I've discussed this before, but this is something that I find very interesting because they were in business with the Taliban, okay, the oil companies. 9/11 happens, and there are lots of questions around 9/11, obviously, but they say they blame it on Osama bin Laden, and so they say to the Taliban, deliver Osama to us, and they say, fine, just send us the proof, right? Now, why was the proof not sent?
Well, we know that the FBI never identified Osama bin Laden as the perpetrator of 9/11. And so that raises the whole question of how much was he really involved? And he had, I should say, denied involvement.
Yes, he did.
I mean, it's hard. Yeah, so it's hard. I mean, when you're dealing with what I call the great game for oil, secrecy, lies, intrigue, they're all involved. So it's always kind of difficult to extract the facts from all the...
But Charlotte, the reason why I'm asking you, I mean, why would they pick Osama bin Laden as the bad guy? I find it very interesting because, first of all, the Bush family had been doing business with the bin Ladens. I mean, they were doing business with the bin Ladens through the Carlyle group. I mean, Bush had interest in the Carlyle group. Cheney had interest in the Carlyle group. They'd done business with the bin Ladens before in Texas. So why is Osama picked to be the boogeyman?
Well, first of all, because he helped form Al Qaeda, and Bush and Cheney had decided that they were going to be the perpetrators of 9/11. I mean, they had it all.
Yeah, but he formed Al Qaeda partially as a CIA asset. He funded Al Qaeda
at one point
to get rid of the Russian, to harass the
that's
Russians
right.
in Afghanistan. So
absolutely, you have to go back. You have to go back. If you really want to understand what's going on in Afghanistan, you got to understand what was going on during the Soviet occupation, so-called, of Afghanistan, and the role of the U.S. in funding mujahideen to force the Soviets out of Afghanistan and create, their Vietnam. And the person behind that was Mr. Brzezinski, who was Carter's national security advisor, but was also a extremely close friend and advisor with David Rockefeller and co-founder of the Trilateral Commission. So to understand that whole history, you really have to go back even farther. That's the value of history. But I think what happened is, Osama bin Laden was blamed for some bombings in Africa. He was made to be the bad guy, conveniently at a certain point of time. And so when it came to the Bush administration's wanting to invade Afghanistan, they picked the guy that had some notoriety as the terrorist leader of Al Qaeda, despite the fact that earlier he had a relationship with the CIA. And by the way, that is another theme that I found out, that when you look at a conflict, let's pick Iraq and Syria, the rise of ISIS. Okay, so this is this new terrorist group, and it is formed in eastern Syria, and then it operates in Iraq and Syria. There is a lot of evidence that it was created by the CIA as a pretext to send troops in there. And this is a phenomenon that happens time and again. This is the war on terror, folks. This whole thing post 9/11 is the U.S. is going to create a new Middle East. And one way of doing it is the war on terror. We know what happened after 9/11 when Bush said, anyone who harbors terrorists, they're going to be targeted. And so there you have it, the endless wars that have plagued our country and taken the lives of our soldiers.
The United States has harbored terrorists. Is it going to, wage a war on itself? I mean, all these terrorists who came in and were the CIA had strong-armed these consulates into giving these terrorist visas. Michael Springman called it the Visas for Terrorists program. They show up here in the United States, and they make sure that the FBI doesn't get that information. So, the United States could just as easily put itself on that list of countries to attack. The whole thing is so absurd. It's just absurd.
There's a lot of hypocrisy involved.
But it all makes sense, though. I have to say, it makes sense on the business level, because a lot of business has been created for Halliburton, for the arms industry for a lot of, and these same people, the oil barons and so on, they're making money off of the war machine, it seems like. I don't know, but when these kids come home and they say, what the hell was I doing over there? What do you say to them, Charlotte? What do you tell them? What would you say if you were to give them a lecture on why they went over there and put their lives on the line?
They were sent on a lie. And the thing is that,
well, they were sent on a lie for sure. But what was the real reason? If George Bush and Cheney and all the people who pushed to send them into war were told to stand up and say, okay, we're going to tell you the truth now. Here's the truth. What would come out of their mouths? What would they say?
Well, they know between themselves that what it's really all about is the United States trying to extend its power over the Middle East and Central Asia and South Asia. I mean, it's a big power move. And to do that, they have to create pretexts, okay? And we know the lie about Iraq and the weapons of mass destruction, which got exposed. But the war in Afghanistan was supposed to be the good war because we were getting revenge against Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, who brought us 9/11. And of course, that issue is still being investigated. There's a book that came out by Roy McGinnis called Unanswered Questions, in which he goes through the ordeals of the 9/11 families when they're trying to figure out what the hell is going on. And I mean, that's serious. They lost their loved ones in the collapse of the towers and so on. So it's very serious. They want the answers and they aren't getting them. And oftentimes you find that there is the sin of omission going on, as well as lies, blatant lies. So this is just a big power play. And what I reveal in my book is that oftentimes a central factor is pipelines. For instance, I was just reading recently, the Taliban are counting on this TAPI pipeline to go through because they're going to get transit fees. And so they want it to happen. And but the troops that went in there, they weren't told about pipelines. They weren't told about the oil and gas riches of the Caspian Sea. They weren't told about the great game for oil. So this is what it's really all about.
Weren't the military installations there in Afghanistan mostly placed alongside the prospective pipeline route?
Yes, that's true. Unfortunately, I'm on vacation and I don't have my files. I would have shown you the map that's in my book that shows the route of the TAPI pipeline, and along it are all the major military installations that the U.S. put in. Most of them going along that pipeline route, and a lot of them were Canadian, by the way, that were sent to protect it. And I was able to talk to a Canadian economist who used to work for the World Bank and BP. And he blew the whistle, John Foster. What?
BP is British Petroleum.
Yeah. He blew the whistle. He saw that Canadian troops are being sent in there to protect this pipeline. And he found out, he quoted from a State Department official who said that the real reason we're in Afghanistan is, quote, or a major reason, I should say, that we're in Afghanistan is, quote unquote, so the energy can flow south. So that's really what it's about. It's so sad. And you ask about the military. The protection of the pipeline is key. And so all the military contractors are happy to send in, all sorts of military equipment to these host governments to secure the pipeline. And the reason I found the military, it was important to protect the pipeline, is because when I originally started investigating the death of my father, that was all about the Trans-Arabian pipeline, which was conceived during the early 1940s, during World War II, when the U.S. after the U.S. had gotten a major holding in Saudi Arabia. And his job for the Office of Strategic Services, later the Central Intelligence Group, which were both precursors to the CIA, his job was to determine what the route of the pipeline was. And according to a declassified document that I got from suing the CIA, his role was, quote unquote, to protect the oil of Saudi Arabia at all costs. And that also meant protecting the pipeline. So I think his job was to make Lebanon. He wanted it in Lebanon. Other people wanted it in Palestine, then Palestine. And his job was to protect that route and win hearts and minds all over Lebanon. But the difference then was that he was an Islamic scholar. He spoke the language. He knew the history. He knew the culture. His cover was cultural attaché. So he was able to achieve that because he knew how to work the networks. And at that time, the United States was very much looked up to by peoples in that region. They thought, oh, the Americans have not come to conquer us like the French and the British did. They're only here to help us and spread democracy. And that's what my father naively really wanted to do. That's what he felt he could serve his government and help these people. And anyway, he died in a plane crash, which is a whole nother story. But this is how I found out, this is how I developed pipeline consciousness, by looking at the Trans-Arabian pipeline. People should just Google it and look at it, and you'll see all the incredible intrigues around that pipeline. The British were furious that the U.S. had gotten this exclusive concession in Saudi Arabia. And so were the French. They'd been left out, you know. So our enemies were actually our allies during that time. Well, and it is still going on.
It's our enemies are still our allies, it seems like. And, you know, it's very interesting because now you're saying, okay, so the Taliban is now, by the way, what is the state of that pipeline? Is the pipeline being built there across Afghanistan? Is it under construction?
The pipeline has been built through Turkmenistan. It hasn't been built in Afghanistan because they can't do it. There's too much unrest. And there is no bank that's going to finance that pipeline unless there is stability. It was supposed to be the Asian Development Bank. But now that the Taliban have taken over, we know that that the International Monetary Fund has frozen all money to them. And let me see, who else was it? So we don't know exactly if the International Development Bank, whose major funders are Japan and the U.S., are going to proceed. The World Bank was the other one. They both frozen funds. I mean, the U.S. has gotten itself in an incredible mess, frankly, and the Russians and the Chinese are moving in big time.
That's what I was going to say. The Taliban, they'll be funded by the Chinese. They'll get their
that's right. And the thing, that's right. And the thing is, they're not sending in military. You know, I found an analysis where what is the difference between what the U.S. does and what the Russians and the Chinese do? Well, the U.S. sends in the troops, and troops do not win over hearts and minds. Occupying troops that kill civilians
and destroy property.
Yeah. I mean, we're asking why this whole thing collapsed. I mean, it's ridiculous. The level of self-delusion, I guess, by the people at the top, that for them to think that they were going to succeed by occupying this country, bombing its civilians, corrupting the local government, horrendous corruption going on from the U.S., who poured in all this money supposedly to help Afghanistan to rebuild and do nation building. But a lot of the money went into officials' pockets. So the people,
yeah, including, I would imagine, U.S. officials' pockets too.
Oh, absolutely. It goes both ways. It goes both ways. I mean, the military contractors, they made out like bandits, and apparently they've got these giant mansions around Washington, D.C. And even, I would say, even the New York Times, a member of their editorial board came out and said that we funded we corrupted the whole system, and we paid off the warlords. And so, you know, we got ourselves into this mess. And now the shame of the withdrawal and the tragedy of the withdrawal, and how sad it is for these troops to have been sent in there to fight and die because they thought they were avenging 9/11. I hope the whole story comes out. I think it's been coming out in bits and pieces. You've certainly helped play a role in that, Christina. And I don't know whether there will be a final reckoning. I hope there will be. It's just tragic.
I see that Rumsfeld has died peacefully in his bed, but I'm hoping others will not, because, you know, as everybody's getting older and, you know, time is a wasting. But anyway, let's go back to this. I'm very interested in figuring out. So do you think the Taliban is going to settle down in terms of, okay, now we're in charge of this? First of all, do you think the fighting is going to go on? Given your historical perspective, if the U.S. is out now, the Chinese and the Russians will come in. Would it be or the Russians? And the pipeline will be done, do you think? Do you think it'll get done?
As long as there's conflict, the pipeline will not be built because nobody will finance it. So it's in their interest, U.S. interest, but also Russian and Chinese interest, that this pipeline be built. Will they collaborate over this? I don't know. But
I mean,
it's not going to happen.
You hear intelligence and military pundits on television all the time yammering about how we got to go back in there and secure this and that and the other, as if, you know, I mean, the definition of insanity, of course, is doing the same thing over and over again and getting the same and expecting a different result, you know.
Well, there may be an incident that's just so horrific that the U.S. has decided it'll have to send troops back in there. I mean, to see the U.S. leave with its tail between its legs. Oh my God. I think the whole world is partly laughing and partly aghast. I mean, everyone's saying that we are witnessing the decline of the American empire. And by the way, most Americans still don't understand that we've got an empire with 800 military bases around the world. We can't sustain them all. And that's one thing Biden knows. Biden sees China as the main enemy right now. And by the way, China is doing mighty good work in spreading its economic development throughout the world. The idea was the New Silk Road, which was a project the U.S. had launched that wanted to connect Asia with Central Asia, and pipelines would be a major factor, but there would also be road building and development of energy plants of various types, and it didn't happen. So then the Chinese moved in, and let's see, what is it called? The road and it's the road and something development. I forget momentarily what they're calling it, but it's the same thing. The New Silk Road, and they're extending. They've got so many countries sort of joining in. And the whole idea, again, is they aren't bringing the military. They're bringing economic assistance and loans, and different countries are saying, I'm in. So this is what the U.S. is facing, a huge challenge. And so Biden, obviously, listening to the same sort of people, I would call them trilateralists, neoliberal faction that has in the past been fairly sophisticated in understanding the world because its major leaders were the Rockefellers during the 20th century. So anyway, that's it. The empire is in decline. Who are the leaders
now? Who are the leaders now?
Well, behind Biden,
yeah.
You're asking me? Yeah, I think they're the same people. I think it's, the Council on Foreign Relations, which is very powerful. And that was initially set up by John D. Rockefeller. And you see, my husband and I wrote a book on the Rockefellers. It's this book on Latin America, Thy Will Be Done, The Conquest of the Amazon. Nelson Rockefeller and evangelism in the age of oil. Some people have called it anatomy of conquest, because once you go to the top, once you go to the highest levels on top of the mountain and look down, the view is extraordinary. So these are players that are hidden. They're very powerful, and they work their networks. And so they're still playing their games for sure. Trump is part of American society that hates the Eastern elites. And I mean, he was able to rile up all this anger against the Eastern elites out in the South and the West. He knew it. And of course, he felt that they'd shunned him as well. So it was like a perfect match. So now he's gone, although he's still, working his own networks.
He's working the sidelines for sure.
Oh, that's for sure. But the big boys, the real ones that are, went to Europe and said, "Oh, America's back." Well, it means they are back. Okay, so Biden is listening to them. So where were you asked? I think I lost the thread somewhere.
Let's talk about Biden for a minute, because I just find it interesting how more and more it's becoming more and more clear that the people who do become president of the United States are already kind of made people in the sense, in the mafia sense, because here Biden, it's clear, just like it was clear the Clintons were doing pay for play in the Middle East. It's clear that Biden was doing pay for play with China and with Ukraine, in the Ukraine, through his son. I mean, the problem Biden had was that, he had his drug-addled son. He was open and kicking down the door so his drug-addled son could make the deals and so on. I mean, all this is documented. It's not only documented. I mean, there's video of Hunter Biden saying, I make gazillions of dollars and then I pay all my father's bills, and so
I wasn't aware of that. So anyway,
he was talking to some chick. I mean, it's just and yet, so I guess I'm trying to figure out. It's like we're a banana republic. We're a very wealthy banana republic because our leaders are beholden to, bigger business powers,
Absolutely.
And they're
first of all,
go ahead.
If you want to be president, you got to go to Wall Street and get their blessing. Otherwise, you're not going to become president. That's the rule in this country. And we found that out by studying the Rockefeller family, Nelson and David in particular, who, by the way, were the main progenitors of the World Trade Center, which is what most people forget about. I mean, even the New Yorkers call the Twin Towers David and Nelson. So, you know, you got to put that in the mix too. But at any rate,
what is your take on 9/11?
Oh, I'm not going there right now. I mean,
why not?
Yeah, that. Oh my God, it is so third. All right. What is my take on 9/11? Well, part of it, first of all, the evidence of the explosions that has come out in the towers, which there's ample evidence, and it comes from the firemen, the first responders.
It comes from various sources. Yes.
All right, and the tapes, and what I found very interesting in the book Unanswered Questions is the families are trying to get copies of these videos or tapes, recordings released, and they wouldn't do it. And one of the family members particularly wanted it because her last conversation with her husband was he was saying, I'm hearing explosions. So what accounts for the explosions, frankly? And I know our architects and engineers have done a study. I think that there is credible evidence that those towers were brought down by controlled demolition. And I mean, when you look at it, hello, so the architects.
But how does that fit into, or does it fit into, or is it a separate incident to the Great Game?
Well, everybody's talking about the Bush administration needing a new Pearl Harbor to do what they wanted to do.
The project of a new American century in this paper called "Rebuilding America's Defense."
I mean, you got to look at Bush. You got to look at Bush as a wannabe. He was not on the highest level, and he aspired to be president and to be powerful. And also, I see him as representing the minor league in oil. I mean, he even admitted, he had an oil company, but it was small. True. And so once they were scheming, Bush and Cheney were scheming about how they were going to get into the Middle East before Bush even became powerful, before he became president.
Well, I would say the father and Cheney maybe, and they put the scion. This is a dynastic thing. I think they put the son there as president. He would be the front guy because, Americans could a lot of Americans looked at him and said, hey, I could have a beer with this guy. So he was friendly and this and that. I mean, but behind the scenes, first of all, his cabinet was a lot of his father's, people.
His cabinet was a lot of oil people and energy people.
Yeah, oil and energy.
They had it all set up. They were going to go in. You see, because when you look at oil exploration in different countries, the people that get there first are often minor companies, and so they do all the exploring and they do the expense of exploring, and then when they find some good size reserves, the big boys come in. I have a quote in my book about that.
Yeah,
this is how it works.
Yeah, Unical was bought up by Chevron, right?
Chevron, that's right.
Yeah.
So there you go. There's a perfect example. And Chevron is the former Standard Oil of California, Rockefeller owned, that got the huge concession in Saudi Arabia. So anyway, how it works in the so-called developing world is that the people who end up ultimately controlling the oil tend to be the majors, like Chevron, British Petroleum, Shell, Exxon, Texaco Exxon. So they're the ones that ultimately make out. Why? Because they have the expertise and they have the money to do the extensive drilling that's required. So you got people like the independents. They are based largely in Texas and in California, a southern part of the country. These are independents that want in, have always wanted in. One way they were getting in was the development of shale oil and fracking. And this is what Trump turned to for financing him. So they were using Trump to get in and get in on the game.
Oh, wow.
And they got in on the game. They were getting in on the game in Ukraine. And, well, that was a major place they wanted to do. What they were succeeding in doing is cutting deals with some of the former Soviet republics to transport their natural gas
So these are
to those countries.
These are natural gas people who funded Trump.
Oh yeah, big time.
Oh
I've got a. Oh yeah, if you Google my name and Counterpunch, you'll find. I wrote several articles about that.
Wow.
Oh yeah, he's totally beholden to these guys.
Oh wow.
So there's that subterranean challenge that is going on.
All our presidents are made people who are being beholden to somebody. I mean, I know, for example, that Obama's cabinet was picked basically by Citigroup, by a Citigroup executive, and so when the bank, and it's interesting because these crises happen that accrue to the funders. You know what I'm saying? It's like the banking crisis occurred under Obama. Okay. And what happened? Yeah. All the banks were too big to fail. And so they made all the money from all their malfeasance. And then they got more money from bailouts. Okay. And before that, it was Bush, and 9/11. And all those people made money off of the war and all those policies. So all these disasters happen, and each president is in charge of, shoveling the money or the resources or whatever to. I mean, I'm saying this as I'm speaking to you. I've just seen the pattern all of a sudden, and it's horrible. It's horrible.
It's all interconnected. And we, the people, are the last to know, except there are a few brave journalists out there that are trying to figure it all out. And
well, it's
which is
now it's
thing.
Clear.
It's hard.
It's very clear. The pattern is very clear. Whoever pays your bills, you do what you need to do to create money for your sector, and I mean, right now, Biden is again, here's a guy who the evidence is like right in your face, and he's still presidenting, and meanwhile we've got these. I mean, I have to tell you, full disclosure, my son served in Afghanistan. He was an officer in the Marine Corps, and the trauma that these guys have suffered is terrible. It's really, really terrible. And the way that they left was even more traumatic to them. It really was.
I know. It was horrific. And when I was writing my book, I discovered an interview with two men who were vets. One of them was Veterans for America, and the other one was Vote Vets. And Vote Vets was more like liberal, and the Vets for America, I think it's called, was more conservative. And they were sitting in the back room waiting to go on to be interviewed. And they started talking. And they started to say, what were we in there for? This doesn't make any sense. And they came out and said that they made not a deal, but they agreed that from here on in, you're going to send troops over there. You've got to have a new authorization for the use of military force. You've got to have Congress allowing it before it happens. And the bottom line is our troops need to know what they're really fighting for, because when they were sent into Afghanistan and they were sent to Iraq, 9 times out of 10, they would see images of the towers. You know, you're going in there to avenge this terrible terrorist attack.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, you know,
very painful for them.
Trust me, it's really bad. That's why we've got all these suicides going on every day, like clockwork, every day. Suicides. And nobody is held accountable. It's really terrible. Anyway,
the accountability part is really annoying. Oh my God, you and I know that.
Well, that's exactly what I wanted to talk to you about, is you actually wrote a book about prosecuting George Bush for Iraq. And I want you to talk about that. And I want you to talk about whether or not you could write the same book and just, instead of putting Iraq, put Afghanistan, you know?
Yeah, well, there is more and more truth coming out about Afghanistan, thank goodness. I mean, people that were over there and saw that this was not going according to the plan that they'd been given. Namely, the troops would go in, they would fight the terrorists, get rid of the terrorists, and then they would bring nation building and bring their wonderful democratic values and all of this. Not
only that, but at the same time, you know, all these people were, you know, oh, we got to find Osama bin Laden. We got to find him, and that these guys have talked about it. These guys who were supposed to be, we were so close, and then we were called off. We were close, and then that he somehow escaped. Oh, so close, and now, and meanwhile, of course, his death was being announced. You know, his death was announced several times, you know, in the course of all this. And actually, and I just read recently that one of the guys who was on the killing Osama bin Laden raid said, you know, he wasn't sure who they killed.
Yeah, the guy they killed didn't match the picture.
The guy they killed didn't match the picture. So even that, I mean, look at the resources and fanfare that went into this operation to kill this guy. And finally, somebody admits, well, this guy didn't look like the picture. And of course, they paraded Saddam Hussein's picture and that of his hung head and his bloody son's pictures. But oh no, Osama bin Laden was treated with more respect. He was allegedly dropped. I mean, the whole thing, the disconnect and the strange, the bizarreness of it all is, you know, makes it smell. Okay, it makes it smell.
The whole idea about him being the capo di tutti capi of terrorists, right? He was the biggest big guy. And what you learn from people who are in Afghanistan is about I would say just a few months after the U.S. was able to defeat the Taliban, they weren't that interested. Suddenly, Osama bin Laden disappeared from the radar screen.
Yeah, Bush himself said, "Oh, I'm not that concerned about him.
I'm not that interested in it."
Yeah,
and of course, then he was allowed to escape. And when I was watching all of this, I kept thinking, well, yeah, they need Osama bin Laden at certain times to justify what they're doing. And so of course, Obama, with the alleged killing of Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan, that was supposed to be, that's great. We got the main terrorists. Now we can withdraw from Afghanistan. And of course, that didn't happen. So during much of the time, I felt like Osama bin Laden was used as the pretext for why we still needed troops in Afghanistan. But of course, now we know they were there for different reasons that the American people weren't told. And one of them was to cement American influence and extend it from Central Asia all the way to Asia. And the TAPI pipeline was very key to that. And if anyone questions it, then look at what's going on now. All you got to do is Google it. Just Google it.
So
TAPI pipeline and Taliban, they're back in business.
Well, do you think then that this withdrawal is not, from the business perspective, from the real perspective, okay, this withdrawal is not a loss. It's just, okay, we're gonna, there's some other pivot or something else that's going to happen. So, let's get the troops out.
I think it's a loss. I think it's a loss. It was certainly of American prestige. Absolutely. It's a loss. You know what they're most worried about? The loss of empire. That's what they're more worried about than anything. And so this is one example. And
well, Afghanistan,
let's remember,
go ahead.
The graveyard of empires in the U.S. is just the latest, right? So it is a loss. No, it most definitely is a loss. Now, there is another factor that may be driving Biden, maybe. And that is, we all know he lost his son in Iraq. And what is often not told is that his son had brain cancer. And it has now been revealed that there are terrible pits of oil and toxic chemicals that have been burning during the Iraq War, and those have been linked to brain cancer, and he has acknowledged it. He knows that his son died of brain cancer because he was sent over to, wait a minute, was it Iraq or Iraq? I think he was sent to. And so I think there's a deep personal thing there too, that he probably understands the futility and suffers. I think he suffers from knowing that all these young men and women gave their lives for a futile.
Well, if that's what drove him
but
to the troops out of Afghanistan, I have to say, I don't want to wish tragedy on personal tragedy on any president, but if that's what it takes for them to realize that they're killing our young men and women in the military for the wrong reasons, I don't know. That's kind of galling that it has to take a deep personal experience that somebody moves the all the resources of the nation based on that. The interests of everybody else,
who can say? It's all sickening.
I hope that's not the case. I hope that he saw the light or something, but I don't know. He's he saw
the light. He saw the light because people were telling him the light. Some of them dared.
I want to talk about. I want you to put on your lawyer's hat. I really want to know if anybody can be held responsible for war crimes in Afghanistan. Just like you wrote the book about prosecuting George Bush. You ran on that platform for Attorney General of Vermont. You said that you would prosecute George Bush for the Iraq War, for sending people over there on false pretenses, which then amounts to murder of each and every person who died over there. Can the same thing be said of Afghanistan?
I think it could be, but I don't think it will be. I mean, look where it went. I mean, Vincent Bugliosi is the guy that wrote the book.
Famous prosecutor who prosecuted Charles Manson. Yeah.
And he started to investigate and try to figure out how he could hold the guy accountable. And one of the big issues is the statute of limitations, but there is none if it's murder, okay? There's no statute of limitations if you can prove murder. So he did this fairly elaborate analysis of how it could be done. It could even be done on the state level. Now, will it ever happen? Oh, it's sickening. I mean, I don't know if it'll ever happen.
You didn't write the book. Vince wrote the book on prosecuting George Bush for murder.
Oh, no, I wrote a book on
the book. Oh.
Vince wrote the book on George, holding George Bush accountable for murder.
Right.
I hooked up with Vince afterwards, and because I was running for attorney general in Vermont at the time, and because his book said any attorney general can do it, you know, bring him to account for murder. So I said, look, I'm willing to take up the challenge. I'm running. I'm not attorney general, but I'm running. The problem, and so I wrote a book called The People versus Bush. Yes. His book was called The Prosecution of George W. Bush for Murder, which was a very daring thing to do. I remember talking to him, and his wife thought, I don't think you should use that title. It's much too provocative. But he said, look, I'm sorry, that's what I'm going to do. So I followed up on it, explained the rationale in my book, The People versus Bush,
right,
and which described my whole campaign. And I sit here, it just galls me how these leaders are getting away with murder. They are, and they think they cannot be held accountable.
You're a journalist, and you know, I'm one too, but I'm more and more, I call myself an investigator, and I'm just, you know, when I talk about something, like when I talk about Bush and, you know, we speak the way we do, I'm not talking about it, you know, because of some political left-right thing. I don't give a damn about left or right. I'm talking about the investigations that I have done and what I have seen. And so, you know, I no longer want to be diffident about what I know and what I've seen, because I have been for a very long time. And I really think, I wonder, as a journalist sometimes, and I wonder if you think about this, when does lying to the American people about something so critical as why we're going to war, should that ever become a crime?
Yeah, it should be a crime, but you have to deal with the reality of the power structure in this country. On the other hand, I'm trying to be hopeful that as we pull out of this horrific pandemic, that has totally stripped the veneer off of the pretenses that we're this wonderful country with equality for all. You know, it's exposed the horrific poverty in the world, including in the United States. It's exposed the racism, and that because of these revelations, there will be enough thinking people who will come together and say, enough is enough. We've got to chart a new course. And there are a lot of people that are doing that now. And they're trying to make connections, that we've been divided. We haven't been divided. It's just that we weren't properly connected. All right. So there are a lot of us. There are a lot of us in this country who are onto all the horrific inequalities in the healthcare system and so on.
The criminality. That's what it is. We're gonna have to leave it at that, because we're at the end of our time. But
wait, let me just end on this. Let me just end on this. In the Renaissance, no, scrap that one. The Black Death affected Italy deeply in the 13th, going into the 14th century. And what happened is, and the word quarantine comes from quaranta, the term 40 days. The ships couldn't unload because of the Black Death. So, and what came out of it? The Renaissance. This incredible new period is a rebirth of creativity and secular thinking. They were rejecting a lot of the religious pretenses, Their art reflected it. And so there are people now talking about this, including me. I want to remain hopeful that we can come out of this and start creating a new world and hold the criminals accountable. It's going to be a tough haul, but I think it could happen.